Hello, Digiday. Thank you. And thank you, Vikram. That was very impressive. 11 best practices for programmatic advertising. How do we fit them all into just 15 minutes? Well, I've heard that we need to slim down as RocketFuel a little bit, so I'll just talk about 7. And I do want to already say that, yes, my name is Roland. I work at, not in sales, I work in the customer success department, quality, productivity, and best practice, which is what I'm doing here. And I work for RocketFuel, and you all know that RocketFuel, as the gentleman from Vivaki was saying before, is the absolute rock star in programmatic advertising. So, what are we going to talk about here? We are going to talk about a few best practices to avoid programmatic errors. Now, all of the best practices are in this blue paper that we wrote, but we'll talk about the 7 most important ones here on stage. These are all based on the best practices from the thousands of campaigns that we have run in the 5-6 years history of RocketFuel. And I'm not talking about why you should buy from RocketFuel today. I'm just talking about how to execute your campaigns, because there's a lot of common practices that you may have brought over from traditional advertising into the programmatic world that may simply not work very well in the programmatic world. And so to be aware of that will make your campaigns so much more successful. The 11 best practices are listed here. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read through them, but they are all in the blue paper, and if you need any more copies of them, then ping me afterwards. All right, the first one, integrating prospecting and retargeting. Many people believe that it is important to have a separate partner for prospecting and a separate partner for retargeting. In our experience, that simply doesn't work very well. At the very least, you should be able to share data across the funnel. What that means is if you are worried about people bidding against each other on the same segments, whether that's in the retargeting space or in the prospecting space, then just make sure that you set up separate pools rather than artificially limiting it to one vendor. Typically, that works a lot better, and you can still keep comparing the performance of the different partners in an objective fashion. We have a script developed in open source that people can use, and people throughout the advertising world use that. That's the Smart Tishner script that makes it real easy to set up these pools, even if you don't have a DMP in place. Of course, if you do, then you can just use your DMP. And one example is from the automotive industry, where just without making any more budget available, just linking the branding campaigns and the mid-funnel campaigns and the lower funnel campaigns to each other, sharing that data, immediately generated 53% more lower funnel actions than they would have had before. So this is a really important practice. Don't just artificially limit the silos to just one vendor. Make sure that the data is shared across the funnel. The second one is to collect data on every page. What that means is we don't just want a pixel to track conversions. I think people understand that funnels can be a little bit more complex than that, but it's also important because programmatic is all about learning. Remember, advertising that learns, that's what we are standing for. And advertising that learns means that we capture as much data as possible from any action that consumers take, even if it's not a full conversion. So it is important to not limit the exposure of a vendor pixel to just one campaign objective or just one conversion page, but really to allow them to track information on as many pages on your website as possible. What that means typically is we will provide a conversion pixel, and then next to that a universal pixel that we will put in the header or the footer of the website so that the vendor can actually get as much data as possible. And one example that we have is, let's say, in financial services where you would have a mortgage application. Let's say that they get 5 conversions a day. That's simply not enough for machines to learn a lot from. But if you look at the more complex funnel and you see that every day 100 people start the application process, even if they never finish it, then why not also place pixels on those pages, allow us to understand, well, what are the people that at least start, and then what are the people that get to the second stage. We will start driving through that entire funnel point by point, and you might even appropriate some credit. Let's say that it's 5 out of 100, then why not also attribute 5% of the success of the campaign to that initial stage so that there's an incentive to keep driving that campaign. The third one I want to talk about is optimizing towards real business goals. Probably one of the most important ones for me. As an agency, you often don't have full insight in what is the real business goal that the customer has with this campaign. But if you want to use programmatic well, then it's actually really helpful to try and understand that and to get more out of the advertiser than just the pure campaign goals that they have. One example was a financial services company, again, that we worked for that wanted to open a lot of checking accounts. That's what they said. So we opened a lot of checking accounts for them. And then it turned out the real goal was to attract a lot of cash, which was a very different objective, right? So then we said, okay, let's reset the goals. Let's just optimize for people that actually put in $1,000 in these checking accounts rather than the $10 in order to get the incentive. Of course, what happened? Overall conversion rates went down. CPA, of course, went up. But the overall deal was much better for the advertiser. So look at the big picture. Look at the return on marketing investment. Don't just look at the lowest common denominator in terms of, well, this is the only metric that the 5 partners on my plan can support. If that is the case, then work with 2 or 3 partners on your plan, not 5, just because you will get out of this lowest common denominator point. And then finally, no padding results or gaming. Difficult point to make. I think this is one of the most traditional practices in advertising, but you really can confuse the programmatic models by stating to the programmatic partner, well, the customer CPA goal is $5, whereas you know the real goal is only $10. Then the program will simply not scale enough. So be open, share the real objectives, and then incentivize them to beat the real objective. One example was with Toshiba laptops, where we had a very challenging goal of ROAS of 5 to 1. And when they started sharing the average order value that they really cared about, they didn't care about the number of conversions so much as they cared about the order value, then we actually were able to optimize for people that would get higher priced laptops and more accessories. And we immediately saw the order value rise so to such an extent that the ROAS went up to 8 against 1 instead of the 5 plus 1, which was already an aggressive goal to start with. 4, relaxing your constraints. What does that mean? Well, it means as traditional marketers, we like to be really tight with our target group. We want to advertise only to women 25 to 49 with 2 kids in the household and who read a certain magazine. And that's all very good in a traditional world where it's your only way of reducing waste. Now, programmatic buys every single impression individually. So there is no point in trying to reduce waste by artificially limiting a target group. What you can do, instead of forcing a traditional segmentation, is specifying those desired targets as starting points. It means that the models, the machines that start running these campaigns will start from that space. And what I like to always compare it to is a little bit in a traditional marketing world, you would say, well, here's a big desert there's a treasure buried somewhere, and I'm going to dig near that tree. That's my target group. That's all that I care about. In the RocketFuel world, in the programmatic world, what the programmatic vendor will do is come out and say, well, the target group is one thing, but I'd actually like to scan the entire desert. Let's bring out the army of metal detectors first to understand exactly where treasure in this desert is buried and start digging in all these 1,000 different points. So we can discover a lot more target groups for you and your clients than you would have held possible. And this is what drives the enormous performance of your campaigns and make them scalable as well. So an example that we had is simply, this was an energy company, and they had given us specific DMAs to target. And it turned out that these DMAs were almost overlapping with states. So we said, well, would it be possible to just relax those DMAs a little bit and target only the states that you're active in? And just even though the areas were almost completely overlapping, that immediately cut the CPA in half, just because the models had so much more ability to try and find the right conversions. 5, testing data models head-to-head. This is something I see very few people do. The typical programmatic vendor will say, okay, this is your target group, so then let's buy these third-party data segments. Okay, it's a little bit expensive, but hey, you want the people that are in market for this and this group. And then they just say, well, see, we targeted that many cookies that were all in that data segment, so we did a good job. What you never see people do is test, is that data actually correct? Is that data doing or saying what it says it does? And we always do this, we always test the data as part of the model. So what we do is we put the data together in the mix with all of the other data that we have, the first-party data, third-party data, our own data. And we will often find that the data, even if it's very expensive, highly premium data, will not actually show significant lift on the campaign whatsoever. And so just like you do with vendors, please test the data that you buy. Don't just take it for granted. One example in the CPG world, 3/4 of the data segments that the customer specified us to buy were not actually showing any brand lift. In fact, they were dragging the brand lift down. And so this really is not an effective way to spend your money. Do buy data, by all means. The more data, the better. But please always test whether that data actually has a good effect on your campaign. And then jumping a few, because I can only do 7 today, embracing view-through conversions. A bit of a controversial topic still in some areas, but we really see over all these campaigns that we do that view-through conversions really drive stronger funnel growth, especially for those that want to get closer to longer-term objectives like average order value, like the value of a customer, even the lifetime value of a customer. Oversimplifying your attribution is really easy, of course, and it avoids a lot of politics, but it really doesn't drive your long-term business objectives. We are big fans of algorithmic attribution solutions. There's a few in the marketplace out there that really try to calculate live and do tests on, well, if I spend a little bit more money here, then will it drive a better success rate or not? And one example from a fast food delivery service, initially they were focused completely on clickers, but it turned out that the clickers were very much correlated with people that would buy only once and would buy maybe only one item on the menu. Whereas once they started focusing on view-through people, these were the people that were already much more ingrained with the brand, and they saw an 8.8 times higher rate of repeat customers plus a higher average order value. And so that customer was really convinced that view-through for them works a lot better in reaching their strategic objectives than click-through does. Ranking vendors openly. I think pretty common practice here, a little bit less in Europe. It is important to tell the programmatic vendors in our experience how they are doing against each other. It doesn't mean that we necessarily need to know who we are fighting with, but it is important to understand, are we number 1 on the plan, number 2, number 3? And the reason is that you are really calibrating for, well, is this customer more interested in volume, or is this customer more interested in the specific CPA? Music distribution service that we worked with, we thought we were killing it, as you see on the back of our business cards, because we were getting 3 times as many conversions as they had hoped. But once they started sharing the results from the other partners, they actually ranked the partners differently, purely on the CPA. And they said, well, you know, we would prefer that you actually have fewer customers, that you bring in fewer conversions, but at that lower CPA, because we're in a very, very tight budget situation and the finance guys don't like it. Just giving us that feedback and telling us that other people on the plan were performing their objectives better allowed us to just trigger the model a little bit differently and reach this minus 20% CPA directly and thereby be first on the plan again. So as a conclusion, programmatic advertising really does require different habits from traditional advertising. These best practices, especially combining a few of them, will drive huge performance improvements. And of course, we're always happy to talk about that with you further.
Ooh, thank you. Now we'd like to open it up for some questions from Roland, if there are any. Yes, one right here.
Hi.
Hi.
So for bullet number 1, integrate prospecting and remarketing. For those marketers that are really looking at have a very specific vendor that they're using for remarketing, it's been very difficult to make the attribution a correlation that perhaps to really put them all together, right? So what is your advice in terms of when you say integrate, how the rationales behind that? Because they're seeing the ROI extremely high in the remarketing, so it's very difficult to move the budget.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points to be made there. One is that the ROI often looks very high because they attribute essentially the entire sales success of the funnel to just a remarketer, which may require a little bit of education. On the other hand, I would say any vendor that you give a monopoly on a certain kind of business over time will start gauging prices. That is typically what vendors will do. So in that situation, what we'll typically recommend is at least create a holdout group of 5 or 10% of that retargeting pool that you let another vendor test on, at least to keep that vendor honest. And that is typically a strategy by which you can then show, well, maybe that other vendor is driving actually a higher ROI or an ROI that's similar but with much higher scalability, and that is then something that creates new options for your client.
I think that is all. all the time we have. Sorry. But we really appreciate it, Roland. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.